Hello, good evening. A very warm welcome to you all to this summer exhibition at the Vitra Design Museum. The exhibition is called Together, the New Architecture of the Collective. And it's on different levels. It's a special exhibition for us. On one hand, we usually do not open exhibitions in the Gehry building in June. We usually open in spring and in autumn. And the fact that this year we are showing 3 exhibitions, that gives us the opportunity to have a wonderful summer party tonight, later, after this talk. So that's a wonderful occasion that we do not have so often. Secondly, the theme of the exhibition is highly contemporary. It is very relevant, and it is not only dealing with collectives in architecture, but it has also been curated by a whole collective, by 4 people, which proposed this exhibition to us. So it is a project that is not as usual done by a curator in the Vitra Design Museum, but by 4 people who collaborated outside the Vitra Design Museum. Of course, they collaborated very closely with us in the realization of the exhibition. And we are also having this collective on stage tonight. So we're really happy to have all 4 people who curated the exhibition and 2 distinguished additional guests. I would like to introduce them to you. It's Ilka and Andreas from Berlin and Basel. They are here. And it's Matthias Müller and Daniel Niggli. They are forming the architectural office EM2N. They are based in Zurich, and they were responsible more for the design part of the exhibition, but also for the conceptual part, together with Ilka and Andreas. And we're really proud to have 2 additional guests from the architectural community here tonight. It's Angelika Fitz, the director of the Austrian Centre for Architecture, and Kieran, he's the new director of ArkDes, the Centre for Architecture and Design in Stockholm. So we have 6 people on stage. It's a collective, and they told me they don't have a moderator. They will organize themselves. So we'll see a practical example, if yes, how the self-organizing collectives will work. I'm very curious. Enjoy the evening.
Oh, jetzt brauche ich gleich einen starken Mann. Ich hätte lieber ein stilles. Ja, wenn die wählerisch sind, Andreas. Super, danke.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Now, thanks, Matteo. The pressure is on. We'll try our best. Actually, what brings us here together is really an interest and a passion in this new type of housing and living that we can discuss in these cooperative projects, but not only cooperative projects, but the cooperative is one legal form that you can use to do these kind of things. But it's also, there's all other kinds of legal forms that you can use. You can use social housing regulations that allow for similar kind of effects. So this is really not the issue. The issue is the fact that more and more people don't want to live anymore in the classical formats of the flat, be it the family flat of the standard traditional family with for 2 parents and 2 kids, be it the single apartment for a single person, or be it let's say the apartment or the retirement home for an elderly person. Those kind of formats that we have come to know as the kind of standard formats of the real estate market to absorb our housing needs are increasingly challenged. And they are challenged because the ways in which we live change right now. And one of the basic observations that we made when we started this process was really the statistics that today in the rich Western countries, more than half of the population, around 60% of people, live in 1 or 2 person households. That means that the majority of the housing stock, which is really made for families, is at odds with the demands of the people. That means we have a divergence between the existing available forms of homes like the single-family house, like the family flat, and so on. And on the other hand, the specific needs of more and more people that don't find themselves anymore in these kind of sociological categories. And this split, this divergence, produces the necessity for housing and for the art of dwelling to be reinvented. This is the primal motivation for this type of production that we want to present in this exhibition. We have this exciting historic moment. We find this really exciting, of a spirit of experimentation in housing. Housing can be so boring in some way, and today it is actually not. This is really the fantastic thing. The first projects that we saw when we started the research reminded us of Soviet revolutionary architecture from the 1920s, the Narkomfim building. Those ideas, individuals voluntarily requesting less individual space to live in themselves and more space to share collectively with others for all kinds of activities that you can engage in a domestic collective context. That's a hilarious proposition. You would think this is only possible in some kind of wild utopian moment of world history, such as in the 1920s. And then pragmatism sinks in and the real estate guy says, that cannot work. Nobody will pay for this. And what we've actually seen is in the exhibition, there's lots and lots and lots of projects where apparently somebody pays for it and where apparently somebody wants to live like that, where apparently this idea of living in a community is not some kind of contaminated area of the hippie period of the 70s. No, it is a very topical kind of theme and concern in changing lifestyles of urban communities. So this is basically just to give you a basic introduction what this show is about. And what we wanted to use this platform in is actually to ask and to talk about among each other why people actually start these things in different contexts, because these contexts are really not universal. They're very specific, culturally speaking, and that's why we're very happy to have people from very different places. We have Zurich, we have Vienna, we have Stockholm, and London.
Still just about London,
yes. And we have Berlin, and we have a bit of Basel. Yeah. And so who wants to start? Maybe Angelika can start. I mean, Vienna is really this. It is famous for its social housing movement. The Red Vienna, the crazy kind of percentage of community-owned flat in Vienna itself. You would say, well, if the state takes care of these things so well, there's no need for those kind of experiments because that's all taken care for. However, Vienna, as we see in the exhibition, is one of the hotspots of that movement. Why do you think that is like that?
It is now again a hotspot of this movement, and I think this is very interesting, and you are showing it so beautifully in your exhibition. There is a long history in different, especially European contexts, not exclusively, but especially connected to social democracy, to revolutionary moment. And I think now again we have this revival, and I think it's connected to the years 2007 and 2008 in let's say, the Western world. I've been working a lot in different European cities during these last 10 years. And we all talked at the beginning of the financial crisis. And at one point, people realized it's not just a financial crisis. Maybe it's a substantial crisis. Maybe it's even a moral crisis we are in. And they really started to talk again about good life. So I think sharing culture is maybe one of the symptoms coming out of that. But it's really, I think, this, looking into the world and saying, hey, what is this all about? What is money for? What does it mean we have a financial crisis, we have economical crisis? And I think even in a context like Vienna, where we have 100 years of social housing on a very high level. It had some ups and downs, but especially at the late 90s when we started something which was called the Bauträger competitions, we have a high quality with public swimming pools, a lot of shared facilities, but still at the moment we have 30 Baugruppen in Vienna, which is amazing because there's no scarcity, there are a lot of Vienna is growing and we need even more affordable housing, but there are still a lot of affordable houses. And the Baugruppen, they are not the cheapest ones, but it's about a different way of life. It's about sharing, it's about ecology. As you said, it's about generations and single person households and so on. And the question for me is, are we exclusively talking about the middle-class phenomena? Like how much money, how much time, how much education do you need to be part of this crowd? And for example, we just opened an exhibition at the Architekturzentrum in Vienna 2 days ago with a sample from London. And I think so one of the many things they are really successful in is to have this crowd making without needing a lot of language and education. In Baugruppen processes, people are talking very often for years. And like in Vienna, if you don't speak German, if you're not educated, you can't be part of these projects. But the question is also, for example, now in the IBA in Vienna, we are talking about a self-building project again, to do a big housing project with self-building processes like in the settlers movement at the beginning of the century, to integrate people without having the same language. And I think this is very important in a time where we are getting more culturally diverse. And maybe stop at this then.
What do you think? Is it a top-down phenomenon?
I think you're not on.
Yeah.
Is he on?
I'm not on?
No, yeah.
I'm not on.
He's on.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Is it a top-down? Is it state-organized, or is it a bottom-up process?
In Vienna at the moment, it's a mixture. It's definitely a bottom-up process, but it's very much kind of connected. There are a lot of interfaces to the public funding system. Right. Maybe that's maybe something we should talk about later on, about, I think, the financial modes, if it's collective property or individual property, if state money is in there or city money is in there or not. I think this makes a huge difference. I think money is very important, money and organization within this project.
And who owns the property?
Who owns the property,
as I know,
yes.
I think still Vienna has 60-70% of the properties owned by the state.
Yeah, but we have problems now to have affordable properties, and I think the question of communal trusts, land trusts, and the question of an active policy and in kind of I think property is the most difficult thing at the moment.
How is that in Stockholm?
I mean, Stockholm is a really interesting example, I think, to put in relation to the extraordinary projects in the exhibition. And perhaps it's worth just saying, like, I come kind of from London. I've been in Stockholm working for just 2 months, so I'm very new to Stockholm.
So how is it in London?
London is a total nightmare for housing. You all know that London is a crazily expensive town, ruled by speculation, not just by speculators and people who have money, but speculators who are individuals, all of whose wealth is in their flat or in their house, and that system seems to be monolithic and seems to be very hard in London to break down. And we were talking before that despite all of the pressures, and despite the size of the city, and actually the relative availability of land, particularly in outer London, that there is very little innovation in housing tenure. You don't see lots of these cooperative projects, and there aren't many in your exhibition from London, which is a kind of surprise when you reflect on it. You perhaps see it more in commercial spaces. Assemble, for instance, are a good example of an architect creating working spaces that are shared, that have shared facilities, where lots of people coexist and can together afford a 3D printer or can together afford a robot arm or whatever. You see that happening, but not in housing. But what's interesting, what I find very provoking about your exhibition for a Stockholm context, is that Stockholm, in a way, already has a massive stock of cooperative housing. Its default tenure, most housing in Stockholm, is cooperative. You buy a flat, you own part of a building, that building has communal facilities that you share and that you maintain together and use together. But compared to the projects you're showing in your exhibition, the radicality has kind of drained out of that system. And nobody anymore thinks of it as a politically extraordinary proposition. And I was just saying before I came in, one of the big cultural shocks for an Englishman in Sweden, you know, you get your flat and you go down to the laundry room and there's a shared laundry room, and there's all these rules, like a long list of rules of what you must do and must not do. And you know, if you leave fluff in the filter of the dryer, you know, you're really you're going to be chucked out by the board of the building. You know, so that's the horizon of communal.
It's bureaucratic.
Yeah, it's bureaucratic. It's become a kind of service, a shared service rather than a shared ideal. And I think your exhibition suggests a more radical, a more idealistic, and more utopian vision for actually a system that probably already works in Stockholm. And perhaps the last thing to say about Stockholm, there are 2 Swedish projects in the exhibition. The Sven Markelius building is really an extraordinary example of architecture coming together with a communal thesis. And this is from 1930. You know, a building with very small flats with a shared restaurant with a lift just for the food to take it to different flats. It was all explicitly about trying to liberate women from having to cook, liberate both parents from childcare. There was a kind of kindergarten on the ground floor. And that still works like that, more or less. The restaurant doesn't work, but the childcare still works in that building. And, you know, and it's seen, every architect in Stockholm loves it, but no one's building any of them.
And why?
Yeah.
I mean, I think central Stockholm has become so extraordinarily expensive that it would be very hard, as we were saying, as in Germany now, as in Berlin, as you know, there's no land available to start one of these projects. But why they don't take a more radical stance in relation to some of these communal facilities, I don't know. I mean, I went to see, there's a housing exhibition opening in autumn this year in Linköping, a city 2 hours south of Stockholm. And that master plan's by a Swedish architect called Okie Dokie Architects, and they've proposed that every block in the master plan has, it's kind of a comedy name for an architect, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
They're very good. But every block in the master plan has a communal facility, a kind of these greenhouses. And inside these glass envelopes are, in some cases, an extra flat for visitors, sometimes a community center. In one is a swimming pool, you know, a dining hall. And there's this kind of top-down attempt to create the kind of facilities that you see in the projects in your exhibition. And, well, we'll see if that works, and maybe they will.
Do you believe that top-down process could work? Is it possible to administer communality, or does it have to grow bottom-up?
In Sweden, municipalities believe it's possible to administer everything.
Oh, that's lovely.
It's my impression so far. Sorry to any Swedes in the room. But you know, it is a top-down, avuncular culture, and still that sort of belief exists. You have to say that what they're building there would never be built in the UK. So it's already at least a gesture towards the communal, which is impressive. But what's really radical about your exhibition is the fact that it emerges from a group of people who desire a different lifestyle, want to live in a different way, and this is not that.
What fascinated us was actually that the projects are so different. And I think that originates in the fact that people actually got together and thought about what they want for themselves. If you administer top-down, then probably every housing development will have the same kind of common facilities. No, I would suspect at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they do. That's what's interesting about this particular master plan. Every one of these common facilities looks identical. You know, so the kind of, but maybe Sweden is a society based on a more coherent view and is struggling at the moment to deal with its rapidly diversifying population, whereas London is already a diverse situation. But I mean, the communal facilities there, it's quite hard to imagine. You know, for instance, one of the buildings in that master plan has a communal swimming pool with a dining space at the end of it, and that seems really nice. You know, you could take your friends for a pool party. But the idea of me doing that with my neighbours as an English person is difficult enough, and God knows, God knows what other people. You know, the very new cultural, the invandrar, the new immigrant populations of Sweden think of that facility. It's clearly not tuned to their lives and lifestyles. And they have to either become Swedish or not use them. And maybe that's how Sweden has been in the past, and it must change. And maybe some of the models you're talking about.
So the developer decided upon their programs, communal programs that would be put into that.
Yeah, before the residents.
Before the residents. But they also don't know who are the residents that would move into these buildings.
No. They're just
which
on
makes
the waiting list. Yeah.
Which makes it very difficult to decide upon collective facilities.
Matthias and Daniel, can you talk a little bit about the Swiss approach? Because we've been hearing, for instance, London, a very competitive housing market, has no cooperative projects. Maybe that has something to do with the kind of heritage of Thatcher, and I remember her famous statement, there is no such thing as society. So the kind of collective, what is that? There's only individuals and individual interests. Zurich, for instance, has also a very competitive housing market. It's very expensive, it's very difficult to get a flat, and if you get one, it's super expensive. And yet, Zurich is one of the beacons of the cooperative movement right now. It's one of the hotspots of architectural experimentation, and also not only architectural experimentation, but also experimentation on the level of business plans that are developed, not only cooperatives, but also interesting cooperations between cooperatives and commercial developers. Why is that in Zurich and not somewhere else? Why? Because I would suspect Zurich at the last to be this kind of pseudo-communist haven of collectivist concepts.
Well, I think there's there's of course a few people here who would know much more than we do, actually. I see Andreas Hofer sitting there, so he would be the perfect guy to answer these questions. But I think first, it has a long tradition, I think, as Vienna. I mean, it has a long tradition of corporate housing. And of course, the real estate market is extremely competitive. That's where the state, again, jumps in giving property in the Baurecht. I have no clue how this what this means in English. You know, Baurecht.
I could pretend I did, but I
Is it leasehold?
Building rights.
Building rights.
Yeah. Building rights.
It's not that far.
I think that. So I think that. I think
You know what that means, Kieran?
Not really. Now you get property from city owns property and they give it to corporations, but of course they give it to different kinds of
They give the right to build, but they don't sell off the property.
Yeah. Which I think is a very clever concept. And Hans Bernoulli from Basel a long time said actually the state should never give away his property because he would actually lose control of city planning, for example, which we sort of agree. But I think the other reason, housing corporations till maybe 80s and 90s were not really very experimental. I think it has very much to do with this other phenomenon that you have a group of people who is extremely bottom-up active, like Andreas or like Steff Fisch or others who were actually politically involved in the Jugendunruhen, when actually Zürich brennt, when there was actually the whole rumble in Zurich in the 80s, not in the 60s, not 68, but in the 80s. So you have basically at one hand you have the state who gives the land, who is willing to give land, and on the other hand you have a lot of people who are extremely creative and have a vision and are idealistic about developing interesting projects.
It was in that sense a movement to reclaim the city. It was a squatters movement. The kids at that time were looking for free spaces, also unadministered spaces, and they were squatting houses and trying to establish youth centers. And I think that became like that squatting school became like a school for property development. After 20 years later, you see people actually kind of really learning the ropes of how to put together the financing, the legal parts, the social parts, the moderating, also trying to motivate architects, because architects for a long time weren't interested in this kind of complicated processes, and then bringing all that together and actually then, now you're seeing all these great projects coming out. But of course it takes a long time, it takes a long incubating time, and it takes a generation of people to really become professional. And also, what is interesting is maybe it's special for Switzerland, but there isn't that deep frustration which some generations experienced that never actually got to the point of realizing their dreams. They somehow made their way through the institutions, and they somehow actually managed to become operative, and then finally started staging their projects, which I find tremendous. And some of them are now commercial developers, and others are still in the co-op movement, and others are in politics. So there's all kinds of paths that came out of that, all kinds of careers.
What we find particularly interesting about that movement, because it was about reclaiming the city. It was not only about housing, it actually was about how, who owns the city? What can you do in the city? Who
decides?
Who decides? And I think we tried to make this an issue in this exhibition, that it's not only about the housing actually. So we're not particularly interested. Of course, it's nice to have all these buildings, but we're extremely interested in how it goes beyond the building itself, how it becomes part of the city. That's why we try to really, pick projects that go beyond the idea of, I have a perfect flat and have maybe a swimming pool, which is nice. It's hedonistic. But I think, what can they do to the city?
I think this is also an important point why administrations in Zurich and now even in Vienna are supporting these kind of projects. One guy in Vienna a few years ago told me from the city administration, I don't need a corporate project or a Baugruppe there. I need it there because this is a difficult new development area and they work like incubators because they give so much back to the cities. They have different functions, they have cultural functions. They are really incubators in new city quarters. And so they are using them strategically now, giving out certain plots in new areas, but you would never get a plot at the moment in the old functioning city. So it's very strategically used.
That's actually very similar. If we think about the Zwicky, Kraftwerk 4, which basically is built in a very difficult site, maybe it was actually, at that time, maybe they didn't really find anybody else who would do the project. And with Kraftwerk, then Pentimo hopped in, Jörg Koch is here as well. So it's interesting now that they team up with institutional players. And I'm particularly happy that actually now these innovative co-ops actually go also beyond the city borders. Because that for me means that really urban life and other attitude incubating not even the city, but let's say the outskirts of the city.
Der Speckgürtel.
The Speckgürtel.
Is it? I'm wondering, is it? The thing that we discussed all the time was really the question: are these cooperative projects, like Baugruppen projects in Berlin? They're so fashionable. People make their little private Idaho, a so-called collective, but it's this kind of private ghetto of happiness. Do they have to be isolated, or can they actually infect the city? Can you turn around the way that a city deals with its entire kind of management of urban spaces? And Angelika, you were just referring to this politician from Vienna who said, who basically said, well, we actually have to curate these projects in an urban sense, so that they can act as incubators of cityness, as Saskia Sarsen said. To then push up, like the development of the city in a favorable way. Do you think our politicians are, like, on a general level, this far that they understand they can make use of this bottom-up level to steer it and take it up, and to basically kind of coordinate this energy in a top-down way? Do you think we're there yet? Because that's what we wanted to achieve. We wanted to provoke politicians to do that and learn from the co-ops.
Actually, I think that this is really one of the most important questions in the future, this kind of interfaces between top-down and bottom-up. We are very lucky in Vienna that we still have a social democratic top-down, which is nice to have, but it's also very paternalistic, and it's very difficult for them. They talk now a lot of participation, and we even have a master plan participation, now especially from the Green Party, who is also in the government. But I keep telling them it's not really about participation anymore, it's about co-production. And you should really make use of these energies, of these people who want to co-produce the city. But of course, it's difficult for social democracy to have interfaces, to create interfaces between the formal and the informal. I think we need something, if we have bottom-up and top-down, we need something like middle-out, and we don't have it so far.
That's exactly the problem in Stockholm, is one of, so I was looking at a project just the other day, which is a community centre where a municipality wants to build a new cultural centre for a municipality, but there's an existing cultural centre that everybody's using that they want to demolish and replace with a new building. And the problem with this is that in the interim, all of those very fragile groups and institutions will disappear, and the new cultural centre will have to be reprogrammed in a top-down way. And this felt emblematic of the Swedish situation. But I think what's interesting about the housing examples you're giving is housing in most countries, or certainly in the UK, is a kind of generalization. It's talked about as units, like how many units are you going to provide? And it's talked about as kind of what type of units, but that type is 3 or 4 types, really. What the projects in your exhibition show is that housing can also be like an institution, can act like an institution. I mean institution in the most positive sense of the word. I mean, I'm a museum director, so I believe in institutions. That's what the city's made of. It's like a kind of structure of committed people who give something to one another, but also to the city. And there's something extremely powerful about that. And it's almost back to, or maybe it's an update of a kind of civic society model. Like in Sweden, they had this, societies of mutually interested people were very powerful part of the social democratic movement, and that's the bit that's kind of fading away as Swedish population diversifies. But in these populations, in these houses, they're acting like little institutions, and that's really fantastic for the city.
Maybe we have a little bit, because you're talking about these different types and typologies, I think it's important to explain a little bit also for the audience what new kind of typologies emerge in terms of housing. So we have, for example, these cluster apartments, which is a kind of update of the shared flat, as we know it, whereas in the shared flat, each one has his own room, and then you share a kitchen and a bathroom and maybe a living room. In the cluster apartment, each one has a little mini apartment within a shared flat. So you have your own little bathroom, your own little kitchen, plus your bedroom, or even 2 bedrooms, because also 2 people can live in one of those apartments. And then you share really huge, very big collective spaces. And so there are cluster apartments where 20 people live together that are not family, and they have 400 square meters. So that's really a completely new, also in architectural terms, new typology of ground plan. So also you as architects, is this something architects now kind of take on and try to bring into the projects when they are asked, not by a bottom-up group, but they can bring this also into this knowledge, or also bring it into when they are asked from a top-down developer to develop something. Has the architect kind of the power to propose these new things to developers, or are they kind of...
I mean, it depends on the setup of the project, of course. We architects usually are at the end of the decision chain, right? So we are handed a brief usually, and I think that's usually quite frustrating, quite a banal brief. So if you want to do that, you have to redefine your role as an architect. You have to maybe jump in with developers. You have to maybe start preparing competitions, not just design and build. I think you would have to a little bit tune the role. In our normal practice, we are not so free to reformulate the programs. But I just want to do a little experiment, Andreas. Maybe we should test our kind of link with politics. Maybe we should ask in the audience, who is a politician? How many politicians do we have here tonight?
Including administration.
1. Yes, we've done it. We have 1 politician. 2.
Also members of the political administration. Well, I see one, but anyway, he doesn't dare. No, okay.
How many architects do we have?
There's a couple. That's great. Yes.
Now that's also part of the problem. We have to learn as architects, as planners, but also as actors in this kind of movement. We have to learn to communicate.
Yeah.
And we have to learn to open up to new audiences. We have to learn how to formulate our wishes and so on. And so that are all things which you don't learn in classical architecture school. It's something you have to be passionate about, or you have to learn, by doing. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's done so little still. And maybe also politicians are not so used to listen to architects speaking. It's a kind of a special language most of the time. So,
yeah, but this is exactly the reason why we made this exhibition, exactly. Right? So we wanted to communicate to the audience to say, hey, people, if you want to live in a different way, there are possibilities. There's alternatives, right? Because we have come used so much to the statement of politics. There's in German you say it's alternativlos. There is no alternative. So the status quo has become the conditioning to accept the situation as is and forget about the possibility that you could do different things. You can do different things. The same has to be communicated to politicians. And it's an interesting situation. In the lead-up to this exhibition, I was talking to various architects in Freiburg, not far from here, who are famous for having invented the building group movement in Germany. And they have made some really interesting projects like the Vauban Quartier, where they have a whole new city extension built on the legal basis of a Baugruppe, of a building group. And for some time, when the government of Freiburg was green, this was embraced. And now they have a second project where politicians said, oh no, this is problematic because only left and green people move into these things, and the new government, I think, is a little bit more darker, dark greenish and more dark. And so they say this is not our clientele. So the new tender for the new city extension is done with private developers. So this is a shame, because I think this Vauban Quartier is quite an interesting experiment, that you can actually see what Berlin has completely failed to do. I mean, we live in a building group in Berlin, and these projects are only privately driven. And the city government kind of saw this happening later on, and now with Regula Lüschow, luckily, but she's Swiss, she understands, there is a possibility or a political will to actually embrace these kind of bottom-up things in a kind of urban strategy with a political interest. But I really wonder, how can you actually push the political agenda to learn from these operations? And I remember when we did the research, Daniel, Matthias, and Ilka, you probably remember, we checked this history of this most amazing housing cooperative or society in Zurich, AGB, which was the biggest housing cooperative firm in the 1920s, and they were so big, they had so much money. At some point, they could have bought every available piece of land, privately owned land in Zurich. Imagine this, because they were so successful. Sadly, they didn't do it. It would have been very interesting as an experiment how the behavior of the property market would have changed. Would it have numbed all dynamics based on individual initiative, or would it have created a situation that is similar to the Scandinavian situation, where the state acts as this kind of paternalist kind of caretaker of its individuals? But it's I'm really wondering, how can we go beyond the situation today where we have these amazing urban pioneers, like in Berlin, for instance, Prinzessinnengärten, these people that created this amazing garden, collective community garden, where you see people from neighborhoods that normally never talk to each other. The Turkish old grandma that wants to build some tomatoes suddenly meets a hipster that also is interested in good basil or tomatoes, and they never meet normally.
Together they made a salad.
They never ever meet, right? And there they meet. And these are the spaces that we need, spaces of inclusion, so that we can get beyond the detrimental effects of gentrification. But what I'm really wondering, what we have no answer, we only have like a kind of a longing and a hope, is actually how the incredible learning effects from these projects can actually trickle down into politics. You know, do you have any ideas how this works? Whom do we have to call?
Yeah, but I think talking about Changemakers, I think this is exactly why exhibitions like yours are so important. Because housing is something very conservative. It's a very slow medium, and I think you can only desire what you know at the end. And so it's so important to see something different, to experience something different. And I think at the end it's about consumer pressure. Like in Vienna, these different projects, they had already a huge impact on public housing, on social housing. So there is this trickle-down effect already happening on a small scale, but it's happening, you can really feel it. And I think you have to see something different, you have to experience something different to get the new desire, otherwise it will never work.
I think it's so different in different places. I mean, London is the place where consumer pressure just has never worked. Like, there's no future for the consumer. The consumer has no agency in the British housing market, seemingly. But in Sweden, I think it's actually a quite different situation. And what I described before, I think your thesis in this exhibition, or these projects, would have tremendous power there, because actually, I think people in Sweden almost think they're already doing it, but they're not doing it radically, extremely, interestingly enough. They have decent communal facilities. They have quite a fair housing system. There's a lack of supply, but everything else about it feels kind of okay to them. But the quality is going down, the space standards are going down, the quality of communal facilities is going down. So I think this would have tremendous agency there. I think in London you would find people individually wealthy enough. It's not so much consumer power putting pressure on the system, but you would definitely find a dozen architects who've got £1 million to put into a project, because people are well off, people earn money there. So it's surprising it hasn't happened. I think the exhibition is a really important step, but I think, I don't think any politician in Britain would be interested, but I think they would in Sweden. So come to Sweden.
Not even Jeremy Corbyn?
No, I think Jeremy Corbyn would want to do it the Swedish way. He'd want to do it top down.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this is maybe the main question anyway. Are these models all? I mean, yesterday we had the press here. I mean, and first thought, this is very socialist, and there was has this communist feeling to it, the housing, because that's sort of it's a bias, or it's in a lot of heads. But of course, still in Zurich, you would actually ask the SVP, the right-wing party. Of course, they would say, Kalkbräde, that's a place where basically left and green people meet and put up. So the question for me really is, can you actually have a post-ideological discourse? And can just, is it just a model where people say we want to live like this? Do you need to be left-wing or right-wing or whatever, or do you need to have a certain ideology to do it?
I would be tremendously interested to see a right-wing cooperative forming, maybe with a shooting range in the basement, or I don't know. So that would be really, that would be nasty, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be different for a change.
But
or like a restaurant that serves alcohol to 3-year-olds or something, really something super nasty.
Things like this, in a way, already happen in Germany. Yeah. There are the right-wing people who kind of...
On the countryside,
in the countryside, go to the countryside and all these emptied villages, and then they go there and build some kind of communities. So it's not it's not funny.
To do an exhibition
actually.
on
It's called National Befreite Zone.
We have
serious thing.
But I think what will really help the whole thing is that we have to think about new relations between housing and working, and the way we work is changing. We work at home, we work somewhere, and I think what all the urban planners have to think about, and also the administration has to think about, is about mixed use in all these new growing city quarters. And it's not only about big supermarkets or big industry, it's about small-scale manufacturers, new type of working. And I think there they look a lot on these cooperative projects, how to do it. And the question also not only to think about the shared facility within one building block, but to think about the city quarter. It's not necessary that each building has everything. Yeah. Sharing is on a bigger scale. And that's what we are discussing a lot at the moment in Vienna also. Can we do housing competitions, not meaning that we are having big building units, but think about the whole quarter, and there we have this facility, there we have that facility, and it's all working together.
But this would be a great learning effect for politicians in the kind of political conditioning of urban production today from the co-ops. It would be basically to say, yes, let's get rid of every kind of residue out of the functional separation that comes from the Siam Charts of Athens kind of idea, and really embrace functional mix. But if you actually if you try to do this today, you see to what extent our building regulations are still inspired by the 1933 Charts of Athens. And it's a shame that this has such a longevity. But I think we still haven't addressed the key question, which I think Angelika addressed before. Is this cooperative movement that we show here, or these projects, is it basically a lifestyle choice of the happy few that can afford it? Or do these projects contribute to more social equality and justice? Because I remember one of the important players, for instance, in Berlin of cooperative housing, Christian Schöning, who heads this office called Die Zusammenarbeiter. He once said, Baugruppen movement today is what social housing used to be before. And I'm not really sure if that's the case. What do you think? Could it be that? Is there a chance for actually people who cannot really afford to be part of these projects to become part of them anyway? Is there an egalitarian dynamics built into the system?
I mean, I think there can be. I think your projects, on a first reading anyway, the projects in your exhibition look unideological. They're presented fairly like that. But built into the nature of the co-op is potential to scale, the potential to include many different kinds of actors, as long as you kind of practice it as a kind of democratic project, not as a commercial one. And that's I think, like, in a way, the existing Swedish system is that. As I said, it's just not it's not evenly distributed. So I definitely think it has that potential.
I mean, it's also very different if you talk about Baugruppe or if you talk about co-op, because they are so different in terms of when you do a Baugruppe, that's a bunch of people that come together, they form a society, they ask an architect, they commission an architect to build them a house. And after the house is built, each one owns the apartment. So it's a very completely different way of doing something together as a co-op, where you get the kind of a member of this co-op, and then you can also get out again. So I think it's very different. I think maybe we should also ask at some point the audience if there are kind of questions they would like to ask us. So,
can I? Because I might want to ask Andreas, for example. You think? Because I'm not so optimistic, because the trickle-down effect will of course happen, and we will learn from typologies. And as I know, in the Kraftwerk, the biggest cluster in the Zwicky is actually not used by I think a group of idealistic people, but I think it's rented to a big company who has Accenture, which I think is fair enough. So it's actually a learning from typology, but at the end, the question is whether you are a consumer, where you just consume also the pool and the sauna and the roof garden. That's one thing.
So how they use it. They don't use it for an office function.
Yeah, I know they use it as, of course, as they live there, because they fly in, they fly out, they stay maybe whatever. But the question would rather be, can you do these projects without a group of really idealistic people who actually carry a project? Or can we transfer typologies? We can, of course, but do they work without a group of people who really have this sort of urge and the idea we want to live together, we want to do stuff together? I know from some projects, of course, that with the spirit of the first initiators, of course, that spirit also gets loose. It loosens up, and of course, then it's hard to get other people in to keep up that spirit. So the question would really be: can we actually? How do we learn from these projects if we then at the end say that group of idealistic people is not there anymore?
Make it a requirement to have a Che Guevara poster in the kitchen.
Do we have a microphone?
Yeah. I think we have to
finish.
This is top down.
So we have to do it informal afterwards.
We invite you all to ask us later directly if you have questions.
Yes. There's many people to ask. Okay, yeah. Good.
But you can have my microphone, Andreas.
No, it's a time issue.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, there's a time issue?
Yes, of course. It's all good.
So is it finished now?
Yes, it's finished.
That was the best end to a lecture.
So now we invite you to all go over to the museum, where we will officially and ceremonially open the exhibition with you together.